the 73-year-old woman who saved a police dog sentenced to death. A story that brought America to tears. Welcome back to Stories TRUEWAY. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And let's dive right into the story. The San Diego Police Department's K-9 unit bustled with its usual morning routine, handlers preparing for their shifts, officers discussing cases, and the sharp barks of trained dogs echoing through the halls. But in a dimly lit corner of the kennel, away from the commotion, Rex lay quietly in his enclosure. His once powerful frame, sculpted by years of service, now showed signs of wear. His fur, once sleek and rich in color, had faded at the edges, and his movements had slowed, stiffened by the cruel grip of time and illness. For nearly a decade, Rex had been a guardian of the city, a hero with 4 legs and an unbreakable spirit. He had chased down criminals in dark alleys, sniffed out hidden dangers when no one else could, and stood steadfast beside his handler, Officer Michael Cooper, through countless perilous nights. But now, none of that mattered. A single piece of paper had sealed his fate. The decision had been made. Rex would be euthanized before the week's end. The official reason was clinical, a degenerative condition affecting his mobility. In the eyes of the department, he was no longer fit for duty. And in a system where efficiency ruled, keeping a retired, sickly dog was deemed an unnecessary drain on resources. There was no room for sentimentality, no space for gratitude. Rex was no longer an officer, just a liability. Outside his kennel, officers walked past without a second glance. For most, it was just another protocol, another checkmark on the endless list of procedures. There would be no farewell ceremony, no retirement home, no last run in the open field. The dog who had saved lives, who had stood between danger and his fellow officers, would be put down like an obsolete piece of equipment. And Rex, in the quiet understanding that only dogs possess, seemed to know. He didn't whimper, he didn't protest, he simply rested his head on his paws, his deep brown eyes watching the world he had once protected slip away. But outside the walls of that kennel, beyond the cold bureaucracy of the department, someone was about to change everything. Margaret Thompson, a 73-year-old retired veterinary nurse, had always believed that every life, human or animal, deserved dignity. And when she heard of Rex's fate, something inside her ignited. This was not just a dog. This was a hero. And she would not let him die. Margaret Thompson had spent her entire life fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. A retired veterinary nurse with decades of experience caring for injured and abandoned animals. She had seen too many souls discarded by a world that deemed them useless. But nothing had prepared her for the sheer injustice of what was about to happen to Rex. The moment she heard about the police department's decision, something inside her twisted with outrage. She knew how the system worked: cold, indifferent, and efficient. It didn't care about loyalty. It didn't care that Rex had given his entire life to protecting others. He had served, and now, like an old piece of equipment, he was being tossed aside. Margaret refused to accept that. Clutching her worn leather purse, she stormed into the San Diego Police Department, her silver hair pulled into a tight bun, her eyes flashing with a fire that belied her age. She wasn't here to ask politely, she was here to demand justice. Inside the K-9 unit's office, Captain Richard Stevens sat behind his desk, his expression impassive as Margaret stood before him. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand your concern," he said, his tone clipped and businesslike. "But Rex's condition is irreversible. The department has strict policies. We can't afford to keep a non-working dog." Margaret's hands tightened into fists at her sides. "Can't afford to keep him? That dog has saved lives. He's risked everything for this city. And this is how you repay him? A quiet death in a back room?" Stevens sighed, rubbing his temples. "We have protocols, Mrs. Thompson. We don't make exceptions." Margaret leaned forward, her voice low and sharp. "Then maybe your protocols are broken." But the captain's face was set like stone. Bureaucracy was a machine, and it didn't stop for sentimentality. Margaret stormed out of the office, her heart pounding with fury. The cold finality in Stevens' voice made one thing clear: no amount of pleading would save Rex. The system had already decided his fate. But Margaret wasn't done yet. If the department wouldn't listen, then she would make them listen. She went home and called her granddaughter. "Sarah, a sharp-witted 24-year-old with a talent for social media and a fierce love for animals. Inherited from her grandmother, Sarah, Margaret said, her voice shaking, "I need your help. We're going to save a dog." And just like that, the battle for Rex's life had begun. Margaret Thompson had always believed that words held power. But in today's world, words weren't just spoken, they were shared, spread, and amplified. And if the police department thought they could quietly erase Rex without anyone noticing, they were about to be proven terribly wrong. Sitting in her modest living room, Margaret watched as her granddaughter, Sarah, worked with laser focus, her fingers flying over her laptop keyboard. The glow of the screen reflected in her determined eyes as she crafted a post that would change everything. It read, "This is Rex, a hero, a protector, a dog who spent his entire life serving the San Diego Police Department. And now? Now, they've decided he's no longer useful. Instead of letting him live out his final years with love and dignity, they're going to put him down like a broken tool. This is not how we treat our heroes. We need to save Rex. We need to stop this injustice before it's too late. Share this. Let's give this warrior the ending he deserves." Within minutes, the post was up. Within hours, it was everywhere. The internet caught fire. Animal lovers, veterans, rescue organizations, people from all walks of life shared and reshared Rex's story. Comments poured in by the thousands. Some were outraged, others heartbroken. Many offered money, homes, and veterinary care if only Rex could be spared. "This is disgusting. A police dog isn't just a tool. He's a partner. Tell me where Rex is. I will drive across the country to adopt him." They wouldn't do this to a human officer. Why do they think his life is worth less? Soon, local news stations picked up the story. Reporters started calling the San Diego Police Department, demanding answers. Protesters showed up outside the K9 unit headquarters, holding signs that read, "Justice for Rex," and "A hero deserves a second chance." But the real turning point came when a familiar face stepped into the fight. Officer Michael Cooper, Rex's former handler. He had stayed silent when he first heard the news, bound by duty and an internal conflict that twisted in his gut. But when he saw Margaret's post, when he saw the images of Rex behind bars, awaiting his fate like a criminal, he knew he couldn't stay quiet any longer. That night, he recorded a video, sitting in his dimly lit apartment, still in uniform from his shift. He looked straight into the camera, his voice heavy with emotion. "This is Rex. He's not just a police dog. He's my partner, my friend. He saved lives, he saved my life. And now, because he can't run as fast, because he's a little slower, they've decided he doesn't deserve to live. That's not justice. That's not right. And I can't stand by and let this happen." He paused, his jaw tightening as he swallowed back the lump in his throat. "Please, help me save him." The video went viral in minutes. By the next morning, #SaveRex was trending nationwide. News anchors discussed it on morning shows. Celebrities retweeted it. And inside the San Diego Police Department, chaos erupted. Phones rang off the hook. The department's public relations team scrambled to contain the wildfire of outrage. And in his office, Captain Richard Stevens stared at his inbox, which was flooded with thousands of emails. The world was watching. And now, they had no choice but to respond. The video of Officer Michael Cooper spread like wildfire. News anchors replayed his emotional words. Social media buzzed with discussions. And the public outcry reached a fever pitch. But inside the cold, gray walls of the San Diego Police Department, something far different was brewing: resistance. Captain Richard Stevens sat at his desk, staring at the chaos unfolding outside his window. Protesters had gathered, holding signs with Rex's face plastered across them. Their voices rang out in chants demanding justice, their presence a growing thorn in the department's side. Stevens sighed heavily and turned to his assistant. "Get me Cooper, now." Minutes later, Officer Michael Cooper stood in his captain's office. His jaw clenched, his posture tense. He knew why he had been summoned. "You had no right to do that," Stevens growled, throwing a printed screenshot of the video onto his desk. "Do you have any idea the kind of trouble you've caused? The mayor's office is calling. The commissioner is furious. We don't make decisions based on public sentiment." "Cooper." Michael's hands balled into fists. "We should," he shot back. "This isn't just public sentiment. This is a life. A life that saved people. A life that still has value. How can we justify killing him when there are other options? Stevens exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. It's policy. And it's final. Michael stepped forward, his voice lowering to a plea. Then change the policy. Sir, I worked with Rex for years. He's not some disposable tool. He's a partner, a soldier in his own right. If he were human, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Stevens met his gaze, his face unreadable. For a fleeting moment, something in his expression wavered, but then, as quickly as it had come, the moment was gone. He shook his head. This isn't your fight anymore. Cooper, your time with Rex is over. Michael's chest tightened. The words felt like a slap. My time with him is never over, he said, his voice laced with quiet anger. You might be willing to forget everything he's done. I'm not. He turned and stormed out of the office. The second the door slammed behind him, he pulled out his phone. If the department refused to listen, then he'd take it to the only people who could force their hand, the public. And this time, he wouldn't just be pleading for Rex's life. He would be fighting for every service dog who had ever been thrown away. The San Diego Police Department was under siege, not by criminals, but by something even more relentless. The public. The outrage over Rex's impending fate had reached a boiling point. News vans lined the streets outside the K-9 unit headquarters, their cameras rolling as protesters chanted and held signs with Rex's name scrawled in bold letters. A hero deserves better. Save Rex. Loyalty works both ways. On television, talk show hosts debated the ethics of euthanizing retired service dogs. Animal rights organizations condemned the department's stance. Celebrities tweeted their support, rallying millions behind the cause. The movement had become bigger than Rex. It had become a fight against a system that treated loyal K-9 officers as disposable once their bodies began to fail them. But inside the department, the walls remained rigid, unmoved. Captain Richard Stevens paced his office. His jaw clenched as he listened to another furious phone call from the police commissioner. This is turning into a disaster. Richard, the voice on the other end barked. The mayor's office wants a statement. People are threatening to withhold donations from the K-9 program. Do something. Stevens hung up without replying. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He prided himself on being a man of discipline, of protocol. But this was chaos. A sharp knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. He already knew who it was before he answered. Officer Michael Cooper stepped inside, his eyes burning with quiet fury. Sir, this has gone too far, he said. You see what's happening out there. You see how people feel about this. We have other options. We can still save Rex. Stevens let out a slow breath, forcing himself to remain composed. This isn't about how people feel, Cooper. It's about policy, about resources. We don't have the luxury of keeping every retired K-9 officer. You know that. Cooper's hands curled into fists at his sides. Then change the system. Because this isn't right. Rex isn't just a resource. He's a partner, a hero. And the way we treat him now says everything about who we are. Stevens' expression hardened. Be careful, officer. That sounds dangerously close to insubordination. But Cooper didn't back down. He held the captain's gaze, his voice unwavering. Then I guess I'm willing to take that risk. Without another word, he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Outside, he could hear the rising noise of the protesters, the collective voice of a city demanding justice. The battle lines had been drawn, and Michael Cooper was ready for war. Margaret Thompson sat in her dimly lit living room, the weight of the world pressing against her frail shoulders. Outside, the city hummed with life, unaware of the battle raging inside her heart. The protests had grown louder. The media had turned up the heat. But the police department refused to bend. Time was running out, and so was Rex's. Margaret tightened her grip around her teacup, her mind racing. She had tried everything, pleading, reasoning, even mobilizing an entire movement. But bureaucracy was a stubborn beast. They were running out of options. Unless, her eyes flickered toward an old photograph on the mantel, her late husband in his police uniform, standing beside his own K-9 partner, a loyal German shepherd named Duke. She remembered how he used to talk about the bond between officers and their dogs. They trust us with their lives, he would say. The least we can do is honor them when their service ends. Her decision was made. She pulled out her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Sarah," she said when her granddaughter answered. "I need your help. And before you say anything, no. I haven't lost my mind. But I need you to trust me." Sarah hesitated. "Grandma, what are you planning?" Margaret exhaled. "I'm going to break Rex out of that kennel." Silence. Then, "Grandma, that's crazy? Dangerous?" "Yes, but it's also the only way." Sarah groaned. "You could get arrested." Margaret smiled, though her heart pounded. "Then I guess I'll have a great story to tell in jail." Sarah sighed. "Okay, tell me what you need." Margaret spent the rest of the night planning. She mapped out the police station from memory, recalling every detail from her past visits. She knew the security schedules, the shift changes, and most importantly, the blind spots. Years of volunteering at animal rescue centers had taught her how to move unnoticed. By dawn, she had everything she needed. A freshly baked pie, a distraction. A bag of premium dog treats, bait. A leash and harness, freedom. And an expired, but still official-looking, volunteer ID badge, her key inside. As she pulled up to the police station in her old Toyota Camry, she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline she hadn't felt in years. The morning shift was just beginning, officers exchanging weary nods as they clocked in. Perfect timing. She walked through the entrance, her movements calm, purposeful. The receptionist barely looked up as she placed the pie on the counter. "For the officers," she said sweetly. "They work so hard." The woman smiled. "That's kind of you, Mrs. Thompson." Margaret nodded and walked past, her hands steady despite the storm inside her chest. Down the hallway, she reached the K9 unit's kennel. The scent of dog fur and disinfectant filled the air. Several dogs barked as she entered, but only one caught her eye. Rex. His ears perked up. His tail gave a weak thump against the floor. He recognized her, trusted her. Margaret knelt beside his cage, her voice soft. "All right, boy, we're getting you out of here." She reached into her bag, pulling out a strip of beef jerky. Rex sniffed it eagerly as she unclipped the latch. The door creaked open. Margaret held her breath. Rex stepped forward. And just like that, they were running out of time. The metal latch clicked softly as Margaret swung the kennel door open. Rex hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. His tired but intelligent eyes locked onto hers. He trusted her. Margaret's heart pounded against her ribs. She had done it, she had freed him. But the hardest part was still ahead. "Come on, boy," she whispered, clipping the leash onto his collar. "We have to move fast." Rex obeyed without hesitation, his years of training kicking in. He limped slightly, his movements stiff from the degenerative condition that had sealed his fate. But there was no fear in his eyes. Only trust, only hope. Margaret guided him out of the kennel, glancing down the dimly lit hallway. The station was waking up, officers passing in and out of rooms. The buzz of radios filling the air. She had minutes at best. As she walked, she forced herself to stay calm, to look natural. She was just an old woman taking a dog for a walk, nothing suspicious about that. But then, "Mrs. Thompson?" Margaret froze. She turned slowly, a tight smile already forming on her face. Officer Jenny Martinez stood a few feet away, a clipboard in hand, her brow furrowed in confusion. Margaret tightened her grip on the leash. Rex stood still beside her, his ears twitching. "Good morning, dear," Margaret said lightly, just taking Rex for some fresh air. Jenny hesitated. Her gaze flickered from Margaret to the dog at her side. "I didn't hear about any authorized walks today." Margaret's mind raced. Lying wasn't her strong suit. But desperation made her bold. "Captain Stevens approved it last night," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "He figured Rex could use some extra time outside before, you know." Jenny's face softened at the unspoken words. Margaret held her breath. Finally, Jenny sighed. "Poor guy deserves that much. At least." She glanced down at her clipboard. "Just don't stay out too long. Okay?" Margaret forced a smile. "Of course, dear." Jenny nodded and walked off. Margaret exhaled shakily. She turned back to Rex, who had remained perfectly still throughout the exchange. "Let's go," she whispered. They moved quickly, slipping through the hallway, down a side corridor, and out a back entrance. The cold morning air hit Margaret's face as she led Rex toward her car. Parked in the far corner of the lot, away from cameras. Away from prying eyes. Almost there. She opened the back door, helping Rex onto a soft nest of blankets she had prepared for him. His tired body sank into the warmth, his tail giving a weak wag. Margaret slid into the driver's seat, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. She had done it. She had actually done it. But as she pulled out of the parking lot, headlights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror. A police cruiser. Her pulse spiked. Had they figured it out already? She forced herself to breathe, to drive normally. The cruiser didn't move. The officer inside wasn't looking at her. Not yet. But she knew this wasn't over. The hardest part was still ahead. Margaret's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as the police cruiser sat motionless behind her. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to remain calm. She forced herself to exhale slowly. Just another car in the lot. Just another morning. Rex lay in the backseat, his breathing steady, his dark eyes watching her in the rearview mirror. The old warrior was exhausted. But he trusted her. He didn't know what was happening, didn't understand the risk she had taken, but he trusted her. And she would not fail him. Carefully, she pulled onto the main road, keeping her speed steady. The police cruiser didn't follow. Not yet. Her heart pounded as she maneuvered through the quiet morning streets of San Diego. The city was waking up, joggers on sidewalks, delivery trucks unloading, parents herding sleepy children into cars. To anyone watching, she was just another elderly woman driving her dog to the park. Except this dog had just been stolen from the police. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. Sarah. Margaret snatched it up, pressing it to her ear. "We're out," she whispered. Sarah let out a sharp breath. "Oh my God, Grandma. I was watching the security feed from the station, Twitter's blowing up. They know he's gone. It's only a matter of time before they figure out it was you." Margaret glanced at Rex. He had curled into the blankets, his body limp with exhaustion, but his ears twitched at the sound of her voice. "Then we need to disappear before they do," she murmured. Sarah was already ahead of her. "I've got a safe house ready. Dr. Anderson's ranch. He's expecting you." Dr. James Anderson, a trusted veterinarian, one of the few allies they had. His property, nestled in the outskirts of town, was isolated enough to buy them time. Margaret tightened her grip on the wheel. "I'm on my way." She hung up and pressed the gas pedal just a little harder. But just as she did, a second police cruiser turned onto the road behind her. Her pulse spiked. No sirens, no flashing lights. But they were there, watching, tracking. Margaret forced herself to think. If she sped up, she'd raise suspicion. If she turned suddenly, they'd know something was wrong. She needed a diversion. A stoplight ahead flickered from green to yellow. She made a split-second decision. Slamming the brakes, she stopped abruptly just as the light turned red. The police cruiser behind her had to slow down, forced to stop as well. Perfect. Margaret reached into her bag, fumbling for a handful of dog treats, and tossed them onto the passenger seat. Then, she turned and called softly to Rex. "Up, boy, come on, sit up." Rex stirred, his ears perking as he slowly lifted his head. Margaret scratched behind his ears, keeping her movements calm and natural. Just an old woman talking to her dog at a red light. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the officer in the police cruiser glance her way. He barely paid her any attention. The light turned green. Margaret eased forward, her pulse still hammering in her ears. But the police cruiser turned down a different street. She exhaled shakily. They were still safe. For now. The city slowly faded behind her as she headed toward the countryside. The streets grew quieter, the landscape stretching into rolling hills. Rex shifted in the backseat, sighing deeply. Margaret reached back, gently resting a hand on his paw. "Almost there, boy," she whispered. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Not even close. The city faded behind her as Margaret drove into the rolling hills, each mile carrying her and Rex farther from danger. The road stretched long and empty ahead, winding through vast open fields and scattered farmhouses. Morning light spilled across the landscape, painting it in hues of gold, but inside the car, the tension was thick, unshaken by the beauty outside. Rex lay curled in the backseat, his body rising and falling in steady breaths. Every so often, he'd lift his head slightly, his ears twitching, as if instinct warned him that they weren't safe yet. Margaret reached back, running a hand gently over his head. Not much longer. "Boy," she whispered, "we're almost there." Her phone buzzed. She glanced down. "Sarah, we lost them." Her granddaughter's voice came through in a relieved rush. "No police chatter about your car. Nothing on the traffic cams. You should be in the clear, for now." Margaret swallowed hard. "Good, but that won't last. When they start digging, they'll figure it out." Sarah hesitated. "Then we'll make sure they don't find him." Margaret knew what that meant. She wasn't just saving Rex. She was disappearing him. Minutes later, she turned off onto a narrow dirt road leading toward an old wooden gate. A small sign swayed slightly in the wind. "Anderson Ranch, Veterinary Rehabilitation Center." Margaret pulled in slowly. The property stretched out before her. A peaceful, sprawling land surrounded by trees, pastures, and distant mountains. A few horses grazed in a nearby field, their tails flicking lazily. At the center of it all stood a modest ranch house with a wraparound porch, its wooden beams worn by years of weather. Dr. James Anderson stood waiting by the gate. The moment Margaret stepped out of the car, the veterinarian, tall, with graying hair and a kind but serious face, strode forward. "You took your time," he said, his sharp eyes flickering toward Rex in the backseat. Margaret let out a breath. Had to shake a tail. Dr. Anderson didn't press for details. Instead, he moved toward the car, opening the door gently. "Come on, buddy," he murmured, his voice soothing as he reached for Rex. The dog hesitated, sniffing the air, his instincts still on high alert. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, his stiff legs moving with effort. Anderson guided him onto the ground, running a practiced hand along his spine, feeling the tense muscles and aching joints. "Let's get him inside," he said. Margaret followed as Anderson led Rex toward a guest house near the main ranch, a converted cabin now serving as a makeshift rehabilitation center. Inside, the air smelled of clean hay, fresh linens, and faint traces of antiseptic. A large orthopedic bed sat in the corner, waiting for its newest occupant. Rex moved cautiously, sniffing the edges of the room. Then, finally, he lowered himself onto the bed, letting out a deep, weary sigh. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Margaret saw him relax. Anderson knelt beside him, checking his vitals with practiced hands. "His condition is serious," he murmured, "but manageable. With therapy, medication, and the right care, he's got years left in him." Margaret exhaled, her chest tightening with both relief and fury. "They were going to put him down," she whispered. "Just throw him away." Anderson looked up, his expression dark. "Then it's a damn good thing you didn't let them." Margaret sat down beside Rex, running her fingers through his fur. The old dog let out a soft huff, nuzzling against her knee. She had saved him, but she knew this wasn't just about Rex anymore. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The world wasn't just watching anymore. It was roaring. The moment Rex stepped onto the soft bedding at Anderson Ranch, safe for the first time in weeks, the battle for his life exploded into something much bigger. The story had gone from a local controversy to a national movement. Margaret knew things had changed the moment she turned on the television. News anchors sat at their desks, their serious faces framed by banners screaming, "Justice for Rex. Should police dogs be euthanized?" Across the screen, clips of Rex in uniform played, sniffing through rubble, leaping over fences, standing beside officers in tense standoffs. Then, they cut to the protests. Hundreds of people gathered outside the San Diego Police Department, holding up signs. "He saved lives, now save his." Loyalty isn't one-sided. K9 heroes deserve better. Margaret sat in Anderson's living room, gripping a cup of coffee as she watched the news unfold. She had started something, and now, it was unstoppable. Her phone rang. "Sarah, Grandma." Her granddaughter's voice was breathless, filled with adrenaline. "You're not going to believe this. #SaveRex just hit 1 million tweets. Celebrities are posting about it. News networks want interviews. People are demanding answers from the police department." Margaret's fingers tightened around the cup. "What are they saying?" Sarah hesitated. "Nothing yet. They're in full damage control mode. But, it's bad for them. Grandma, really bad." Margaret exhaled, her mind racing. They had forced the police into a corner. But that also meant they were dangerous. People in power didn't like being backed into a wall. Dr. Anderson walked in, rubbing his tired eyes. "Margaret, you should see this." She followed him to his computer. A new video was circulating. Michael Cooper, the officer who had fought alongside Rex, who had been forced to stand by while his partner was sentenced to death. Now, he was speaking out. On screen, Cooper sat in his patrol car, his face weary, his voice raw with emotion. "I never wanted to break ranks. I never wanted to go against my department. But this is wrong. We don't abandon our partners. We don't discard them when they're no longer useful. Rex saved my life. He saved all of us. And I won't stay silent anymore." The video cut to clips of police dogs in action, tackling criminals, sniffing out bombs, comforting wounded officers. Then it cut to Rex, a dog who had spent his life giving everything, and was almost thrown away like he was nothing. The video exploded across the internet. Margaret's chest tightened as she scrolled through the comments. Thousands, no, millions of people were furious, demanding change, signing petitions. Then, a news alert popped up. Margaret's breath caught. The San Diego Police Department had released a statement. She clicked the link, her heart hammering. The words on the screen made her pulse spike. "We are conducting an internal review of our K-9 retirement policies." Margaret stared. For the first time since this started, they were cracking. She looked down at Rex, curled up on his bed, resting peacefully for the first time in weeks. They weren't just fighting for him anymore. They were fighting for all of them. The pressure was mounting. The San Diego Police Department had cracked, but they hadn't broken. Their carefully worded statement about an internal review was nothing more than a delay tactic, a way to buy time while they scrambled to control the fire. But the fire wasn't going out. It was growing. Margaret sat on the porch of Anderson Ranch, scrolling through news articles, her chest tightening with every update. The protests outside the police department were growing. National lawmakers were starting to weigh in. The movement had reached the White House. Then, Sarah's voice broke the silence. "Grandma." She came rushing out of the house, her phone clutched in her hand. "You're not going to believe this." Margaret looked up, wary. "What now?" Sarah handed over the phone, her eyes shining with disbelief. Margaret squinted at the screen. A live press conference was playing outside the steps of Congress. A tall man in a navy suit stood at the podium, flanked by a sea of reporters. His sharp blue eyes scanned the crowd before he spoke, his voice clear, commanding. "I am Congressman James Whitaker," he announced, "and I am here today because of Rex." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Congressman James Whitaker, former K-9 handler, war veteran, a lawmaker known for his no-nonsense approach. And now, he was speaking for them. "This story is not just about one dog," Whitaker continued, his tone steady, unwavering. "It's about a system that has failed those who serve us. Rex isn't just a pet. He isn't just a dog. He's an officer, a soldier, a hero. And yet, the system treats him, and countless others like him, as disposable." The cameras zoomed in, his expression hardened. "That ends now." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "I am introducing legislation that will protect our K-9 officers in retirement. This bill will ensure that no service dog is ever put down because they are no longer useful. These animals give us everything. The least we can do is give them the dignity they deserve." The reporters exploded with questions. The internet erupted. Margaret gripped Sarah's hand, her fingers trembling. This was bigger than she had ever dreamed. Whitaker wasn't just supporting Rex. He was changing the law. The fight wasn't just theirs anymore. Now, they had a warrior in Washington. Margaret had always believed in miracles, but she had never expected to witness one unfold before her eyes. Congressman Whitaker's announcement sent shockwaves across the country. It was no longer just a fight to save Rex, it was a fight to change the system. And now, they were winning. Margaret sat beside Rex on the porch of Anderson Ranch, gently running her fingers through his fur as he dozed in the cool evening air. He was healing, slowly but surely. His breathing was steadier, his eyes brighter. But the war wasn't over. The San Diego Police Department was still silent. Their so-called internal review had yet to yield any action. And Margaret knew why. They were waiting for the outrage to die down. They were waiting for people to forget. But she wouldn't let them. A car pulled into the long driveway, its tires crunching against gravel. Margaret looked up as the headlights flicked off. The door opened. Officer Michael Cooper stepped out. Margaret's heart stirred with hope. He had been quiet for days after his emotional video went viral. He was still an active duty officer, still sworn to uphold the laws of a system that was failing the very ones who served it. And yet, here he was. Michael walked up the steps. His uniform crisp, but his face weary. He met Margaret's gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Then, without a word, he knelt beside Rex. The dog stirred at his scent. Blinking awake, the moment their eyes met, something deep and unbreakable sparked between them. Rex let out a low, soft whimper, one of recognition. Michael swallowed hard. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out, resting it on Rex's head. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. Rex's tail gave a weak thump against the porch. Michael's jaw clenched, his entire body tensed, as if holding back something immense. Margaret saw the moment he broke. The officer who had spent years following orders, who had spent years being part of a system that told him not to feel too much, not to get too attached. But Rex had never been just a dog to him. He had been family. Michael inhaled sharply, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. "I can't be silent anymore." Margaret felt her chest tighten. Michael looked up, his eyes burning with conviction. "I'll testify. I'll stand beside Whitaker. I'll do whatever it takes." He turned back to Rex, stroking the fur behind his ears. "I won't let them forget you." Margaret blinked back tears. The police department had lost its greatest weapon, silence. Michael Cooper, their own officer, had turned against them, and with him on their side. The fight for Rex had just tipped in their favor. The halls of Congress had seen their fair share of battles, heated debates, scandals, and policies that shaped the nation. But today, something different echoed through those historic walls. A dog's story had reached Washington. Margaret sat in a packed congressional hearing room, her hands resting gently on Rex's thick fur as he lay beside her. Cameras clicked furiously, news crews whispering updates into their microphones. Every seat was filled, journalists, animal rights activists, retired K-9 handlers, and even a few uniformed officers. But the person who drew everyone's attention was the man standing at the witness table. Officer Michael Cooper, the very man the police department had tried to silence. He adjusted his tie, his posture stiff with tension, but his voice was clear and unwavering as he spoke into the microphone. "I was trained to follow orders, to put duty before emotion. But there comes a time when duty and morality collide." His jaw clenched as he looked around the room, his eyes landing on the politicians who had the power to change everything. "And that's why I'm here today. Because our system, our policies, they're wrong. The way we discard our K-9 officers after years of service is wrong." The room was silent, hanging onto his every word. "I owe my life to Rex," Cooper continued, his voice growing hoarse with emotion. "3 times. He saved me. And when he was injured, he didn't hesitate. He didn't stop to think about his own safety, he just did his job. Because that's what these dogs do." He turned, glancing at Rex, who lay calmly by Margaret's feet, his ears twitching at the familiar voice. Cooper swallowed hard, then looked back at the committee members. "But when it was our turn to protect him, we failed." A murmur rippled through the audience. Congressman James Whitaker nodded solemnly from his seat. Then he leaned into the microphone. "Officer Cooper, in your professional opinion, was Rex truly unfit for life outside the force?" Cooper's jaw tightened. "No, sir, he wasn't." Whitaker let the silence stretch, letting the weight of those words settle over the room. Then he turned to the committee. "If a human officer is injured in the line of duty, do we abandon them? Do we put them down?" His voice rang through the chamber. "No," he said, answering his own question. "We take care of them. We honor them." He gestured toward Rex. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a chance to do the same for our K-9 officers. To right a terrible wrong. To pass the K-9 Heroes Care Act and ensure that no service dog is ever sentenced to death simply because their bodies have aged." A thunderous applause erupted. Margaret's throat tightened as she glanced at Sarah, who was live tweeting every moment. Their fight had come so far. From a single, desperate act of defiance to a movement shaking the very foundation of the system. The hearing lasted for hours, filled with testimonies from veterinarians, former K-9 handlers, and even families who had adopted retired police dogs. Every voice added fuel to the fire. And when the hearing ended, one thing was clear. They weren't just fighting for Rex anymore. They were rewriting history. Margaret had always believed in standing up for what was right. But she never imagined that one act of defiance would bring her here, to the steps of the United States Capitol. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the massive marble columns and the sea of people gathered outside. Reporters clutched their microphones, their voices blending into the buzzing energy of the crowd. Protesters held up signs that had traveled across the country. Justice for K-9s. A hero's service deserves a hero's ending. Pass the K-9 Heroes Care Act. Margaret wasn't alone. Beside her stood Officer Michael Cooper. His uniform crisp, his face unreadable beneath the weight of what was about to happen. Congressman James Whitaker was at the podium, a folder of legal documents in his hands. Dr. James Anderson stood nearby, ready to provide medical testimony on behalf of every aging service dog that had been abandoned by the system. And at Margaret's feet, Rex, the dog who had survived what should have been his final day. The symbol of a movement that had shaken the nation. Margaret reached down, running a hand over his fur. He was stronger now, his coat healthier. His movements no longer filled with the same stiffness. Thanks to Anderson's treatments and weeks of proper care, Rex had defied every prognosis. He hadn't been dying, he had been neglected. And now? He was living proof that the system was broken. A hush fell over the crowd as Whitaker stepped up to the podium, his deep voice carrying over the sea of people. This all started because of one woman, one dog, one moment of defiance. He turned, gesturing toward Margaret, his eyes filled with admiration. Margaret Thompson didn't just save Rex's life. She saved thousands of lives. She sparked a movement that has reached every corner of this country. Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat as the crowd erupted into applause. Whitaker raised a pen. "In my hands," he declared, "is the K-9 Heroes Care Act, a bill that will ensure that no service dog in this country is ever discarded, euthanized, or abandoned simply because they are no longer useful." The roar of the crowd was deafening. Margaret held her breath as Whitaker pressed the pen to the document and signed the bill into law. It was done. The system had changed. Michael let out a slow exhale beside her, his shoulders sagging with relief. Dr. Anderson gave a quiet nod, his lips curving into a small, victorious smile. And Rex, old, battle-scarred Rex, lifted his head to the sky and let out a single, powerful bark. The sound was met with cheers, with tears, with a wave of emotion that swept through the crowd. Margaret knelt down beside him, cupping his face in her hands. "We did it, boy," she whispered. "You did it." Rex wagged his tail, pressing his nose against her palm. For the first time since this fight began, Margaret felt the weight finally lift. Rex was safe. But more than that, they had changed the future for every service dog that would come after him. And that was a victory worth fighting for. 1 year later, the sun rose over Anderson Ranch, spilling golden light across the fields where dogs once deemed unfit now ran free. The gentle rustling of trees in the breeze mixed with the rhythmic thumping of wagging tails and the joyous barks of retired K-9 officers, dogs who had been given a second chance. At the center of it all, Rex lay on the wide wooden porch, his head resting on his paws, watching as handlers and volunteers moved across the ranch. He was older now, his muzzle streaked with more gray, but his eyes held the same sharp, knowing gaze they always had. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a symbol. Margaret sat beside him in a rocking chair, a warm cup of tea in her hands. Her heart swelled as she looked over what had been built in the wake of their fight. The K-9 Heroes Care Act had changed everything. Across the country, retired service dogs were now protected. Instead of being discarded, they were placed in specialized rehabilitation centers, adopted into loving homes, or provided lifelong care by the very handlers who had served beside them. But Anderson Ranch had become more than just a refuge. It was the first ever official K-9 retirement and rehabilitation center in the country. A place where dogs who had spent their lives saving others could finally rest, recover, and be celebrated for their service. Margaret smiled as she watched a group of young police recruits step onto the ranch. Led by Officer Michael Cooper, he had left the department's politics behind and taken on a new role, training future handlers on the importance of lifelong commitment to their K-9 partners. As he spoke, he gestured toward Rex. "This dog right here," he told them, voice filled with reverence, is the reason we're standing here today. The reason the law changed. Because someone refused to accept that his life was disposable. Margaret met Michael's gaze, and in that shared moment, they both understood. This wasn't just about one dog anymore. It was about all of them, past, present, and future. Sarah appeared beside her, grinning as she held up a tablet. "Grandma, you won't believe this. The Service Dog Retirement Foundation just got approval to open 5 more centers across the country. We're officially a nationwide program." Margaret chuckled, shaking her head in amazement. She had never planned for any of this. She had simply followed her heart. And somehow, one act of courage had set off a chain reaction that changed thousands of lives. Dr. Anderson walked up, holding a fresh set of medical reports. He crouched down beside Rex, scratching the dog behind the ears before checking his vitals. "You know," Anderson said with a smile, "when you first brought him here, I thought we were just giving him a comfortable retirement. But he's stronger than any of us expected." Margaret glanced at Rex, who lifted his head proudly at the words. She ran a hand over his fur. "Heroes don't just fade away," she murmured. "They live on." And as the sun dipped lower over Anderson Ranch, casting long golden shadows, Rex closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, not in pain, but in peace. He was home, and his legacy would live forever. As the sun sets on Rex's incredible journey, we are reminded that one act of kindness can spark a movement. One voice can inspire change. And one hero, no matter how small, can leave behind a legacy that lasts forever. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Join us in sharing stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us of the power of compassion. Right finger subscribe to Stories TRUEWAY and be part of a community that believes in the extraordinary power of human and animal bonds. Speech Balloon, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What did this story mean to you? Loudspeaker, and don't forget to like, share, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story that could change the world. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep believing in the power of true stories. Black Heart, thank you for watching Stories TRUEWAY. Black Heart.